At 88 years old, Robert Redford, the golden face of Hollywood's golden era, broke his silence. For decades, audiences knew him as the rebel outlaw in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the charming con man in The Sting, and the rugged romantic who carried both grit and grace on screen. But behind the carefully framed shots and the public persona, there lived a man who carried secrets far heavier than any role he ever played. And at the twilight of his life, Robert Redford finally let one of those secrets slip. Not about money, not about Hollywood politics, but about something far more human, something that even the brightest spotlight could never capture. His confession was about love, the love of his life, a woman who shaped him, saved him, and defined him in ways no script could have written. This is the story Robert Redford carried in silence for decades, until the end of his life, when he finally admitted what mattered most. Robert Redford's beginnings were anything but glamorous. Born in Santa Monica, California in 1936, he grew up in a modest working-class family. His father was a strict accountant, his mother a devoted homemaker. There were no red carpets or flashing cameras in his childhood, only the steady rhythms of a household that prized discipline and responsibility. But Robert was different. He wasn't a scholar. He wasn't the kid eager to bury himself in books. He was restless to move, to create, to discover something beyond the walls of a classroom. He found himself on the tennis court, in the open air, or hunched over a sketchbook drawing faces that fascinated him. Where others saw structure, Robert saw possibility. Where others saw routine, he saw escape. And then came a moment that would etch itself into his memory forever. As a teenager, he was chosen to warm up with the great Pancho Gonzalez, one of the fiercest and most respected tennis players of the time. Imagine it. The young Robert Redford, not yet an icon, not even close, standing across from a living legend. That fleeting match was not about victory, it was about revelation, a glimpse of the extraordinary hiding within an ordinary boy. But talent and promise couldn't shield him from mistakes. At the University of Colorado, Redford was given a baseball scholarship, a ticket to a stable future. Yet stability never sat easily with him. Nights of heavy drinking pulled him away from responsibility, away from the scholarship, away from his studies. Eventually, the university expelled him. For many, that would have been the end of the story, a cautionary tale about wasted potential. But for Robert Redford, it was the beginning, the crack that allowed light to break through. With his scholarship gone and his direction unclear, he made a choice that would change everything. He left America behind. Robert boarded a ship to Europe, carrying almost nothing but sketchbooks and the hunger of youth. Paris became his classroom, the left bank cafes his lecture halls. He sketched strangers with ink-stained fingers, absorbing the bohemian spirit of the city. In Spain, he lived cheaply, painting on street corners, learning how to stretch a single coin across days. In Italy, he lost himself in the Renaissance beauty of Florence and Rome, realizing that art, true art, had the power to outlive centuries. He wasn't chasing stardom then. He was chasing identity. Those years wandering Europe were his crucible. He learned the power of observation, the discipline of patience, and the poetry of struggle. Years later, Redford would admit that Europe had changed him more than any classroom ever could. It wasn't just travel, it was transformation. When he finally returned to the United States, he carried with him not just sketches, but a new sense of purpose. He enrolled at Pratt Institute in New York to study painting. Brush in hand, he tried to give form to the things he had absorbed abroad. But something else began tugging at him. Something dynamic, something alive. That pull led him to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. There, canvases gave way to scripts. Colors gave way to characters. Redford discovered the stage. But success didn't fall into his lap. It was a grind, audition after audition, rejection after rejection. He took small parts on stage, guest roles on television shows like The Twilight Zone and Perry Mason. They were modest beginnings, but each role, no matter how small, carved him into a sharper performer. The restless wanderer was becoming something more, a storyteller. It was during these struggling years in New York that Robert Redford met Lola Van Wagenen. She was everything he wasn't, grounded, composed, shaped by her Mormon upbringing. He, by contrast, was restless, rebellious, searching. Their differences might have divided them, but instead, they became the spark. Against all odds, their love deepened. In 1958, still barely more than kids, they eloped. It was a union forged not in glamour, but in rebellion, against convention, against disapproving parents, against the idea that love should wait. Those first years of marriage were hard. Cramped apartments, unpaid bills, and endless uncertainty about whether Robert's acting dreams would ever amount to anything. But Lola stood by him. Through every rejection, every slammed door, every night he doubted himself. She was there. And then tragedy struck. Their first child, a son named Scott, died of sudden infant death syndrome at just 2 months old. For Robert, it was a wound that never truly healed. He later admitted the grief stayed with him all his life. Yet in that darkness, Lola became his anchor. Her faith, her resilience, her quiet strength carried him through. Behind the man who would one day be called a legend stood a woman who had held his broken pieces together. By the early 1960s, Robert was no longer just a struggling actor. In 1963, Neil Simon's Barefoot in the Park gave him his first breakthrough. On Broadway and later on film, he played the charming young husband with a natural warmth that made audiences fall in love with him. And then came 1969, Butch Cassidy in The Sundance Kid. Paired with Paul Newman, Redford's performance as the Sundance Kid didn't just make him a star, it made him an icon. The chemistry between Newman and Redford was electric, the film an international sensation. Overnight, Robert Redford became a household name. The restless boy, the failed student, the wanderer in Europe, he was now Sundance, and Sundance would follow him forever. But fame always comes at a price. As his career soared, Robert's marriage began to strain. Film sets took him across the world. Promotions consumed months of his life, and the weight of raising their 3 surviving children, Shauna, David, and Amy, fell heavily on Lola. Redford admitted years later, with painful honesty, that ambition consumed him. He chased greatness, sometimes at the cost of being present at home. Fame gave him the world, but it also stole from him the quiet moments of fatherhood, the ordinary joys of family dinners and bedtime stories. It was the paradox of his life. The very ambition that built his career also cracked the foundation of his marriage. By the mid-1980s, Robert Redford was at the height of his fame. His films dominated the box office. His influence stretched beyond Hollywood through the Sundance Film Festival, and his face was etched into cinema history. But behind the curtain, the marriage that had been his anchor for nearly 3 decades was unraveling. In 1985, after 27 years together, Robert and Lola divorced. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't a scandal splashed across headlines. It was quiet, almost respectful. A recognition that sometimes even love cannot withstand the tides of time and ambition. Yet Redford never denied her importance. In later interviews, he called Lola the love of my life, the woman who believed in him before the world did, who endured poverty, who held him through tragedy, who raised their children while he built an empire. Hollywood knew Robert Redford as a legend, but Robert himself knew that his greatest role was not Sundance, not Gatsby, not the con man in The Sting. His greatest role was the man Lola helped him become, and in his final years, this was the confession he wanted the world to know. In the years after his quiet separation from Lola, Robert Redford entered a new chapter of life that was both triumphant and deeply lonely. The world still saw him as the golden boy of Hollywood, the eternal Sundance Kid whose face never seemed to age, but inside he was confronting the truth of what fame had cost him. He poured himself into work, into activism, into building something that would last longer than the fleeting glamour of stardom. Yet even as he stood on red carpets and collected awards, the question never left him. Who was he when the cameras stopped rolling? And who would be by his side when the lights went dark? He found himself in the mountains of Utah more often than not, retreating from the chaos of Los Angeles. There, surrounded by the quiet snow and whispering trees, he built Sundance. Not just the festival, but the idea of it, a haven for independent voices, a stage for artists who had no stage. It was his gift to others, a way of giving young dreamers the same chance he once desperately needed. The festival became a force of nature in Hollywood, changing the landscape of film forever. Yet for Redford, it was also deeply personal. It gave him something to nurture when so much in his private life felt broken. His children, each carving their own paths, carried with them both the blessings and the burdens of his legacy. His son James, known as Jamie, grew into a passionate storyteller like his father, creating documentaries that touched on the environment and social justice. Redford often said he saw in Jamie the fire that had once burned in him as a younger man. That bond was precious, unshakable. But tragedy struck again when Jamie battled cancer for years and ultimately passed away in 2020. Losing his son was a wound that reopened every scar from the past. He had lost a child once before. Now in his later years, he faced that heartbreak again. To those who knew him, it was clear the grief would never fully leave his eyes. Despite everything, Redford kept moving forward. He aged with grace, refusing to let time or pain steal his spirit. In the 1990s, a new love quietly entered his life. Sibylle Sagers, a German artist with a soul as free as his own, became his partner. Unlike the turbulence of his younger years, this relationship brought him peace. Sibylle shared his love of nature, his appreciation for art, his yearning for a life away from the chaos of fame. With her, Redford found balance. They lived simply in Utah, in a home surrounded by the land he cherished, where mornings were filled with stillness and nights with the glow of firelight. After decades of running, he had finally found someone with whom he could rest. Marriage to Sibylle came much later, in 2009, long after he had stopped caring what the public thought of him. To him, it wasn't about appearances or headlines. It was about connection, about finding someone who understood the weight of everything he had carried. And though he never stopped speaking of Lola as the love who defined his youth, Sibylle became the companion who gave him serenity in old age. It was not about replacing the past, but about learning to live with it. Even as he stepped away from acting, Redford remained a presence the world couldn't ignore. He directed, he mentored, he used his voice for causes that mattered to him. He fought for the environment, for Native American rights, for truth in storytelling. He had once been a boy dismissed as a failure, kicked out of school for drinking, drifting aimlessly through Europe. Now he was a man who had bent Hollywood to his will and built institutions that would outlive him. To the public, he was still an untouchable figure, larger than life. But in his quiet moments, he was a man haunted by losses, softened by love, and humbled by time. As the years wore on, interviews with him took on a different tone. The once guarded actor, known for deflecting personal questions, began to let small truths slip through. He spoke of family more than fame, of mountains more than movies, of peace more than power. When asked about regrets, he rarely mentioned career choices. Instead, he talked about absence, about the moments he missed while chasing his dreams, about the dinners he wasn't home for, about the children he wished he had been more present for. His candor was startling, even heartbreaking, because it revealed that the man who had everything still longed for the simplest things. It was in one of these late interviews, his hair now silver, his voice slower but steady, that Robert Redford finally spoke words that stunned everyone listening. He said that for all the accolades, the films, the awards, the money, there was only one truth that stayed with him until the end. He said that the greatest achievement of his life was not Sundance, not Butch Cassidy, not The Sting, not even his Academy Award. It was the love he had once shared, the kind of love that had carried him from the streets of New York when he had nothing, through the birth of his children, through the loss of his first son, through the nights when doubt nearly consumed him. He admitted that no role, no stage, no spotlight could ever compare to the way Lola Van Wagenen had believed in him. He called her his beginning, the foundation on which everything else was built. She was, in his own words, the love of my life. The world was stunned, not because he confessed love. Robert Redford had been linked to countless women over the years, but because of the raw honesty in his voice. He didn't say it like a man reciting lines. He said it like someone who had lived nearly 9 decades and finally wanted the truth to be known. After so many years of silence, he admitted that the golden boy of Hollywood was, at his core, a man defined not by fame, but by love and loss. And when Robert Redford passed away in 2025 at the age of 88, that confession lingered in the air like an unfinished melody. Fans mourned the legend, but those who had listened closely knew that what he wanted to leave behind was not just a filmography, it was a reminder that even at the heights of power, even when the world calls you an icon, you are still human. You are still shaped by the people who believed in you when no one else did. In the end, Robert Redford's story was not about Hollywood at all. It was about a boy who failed, a man who wandered, an artist who fought, a father who grieved, a lover who cherished, and finally a soul who confessed. He left behind a legacy carved not only in film, but in the quiet acknowledgement that the greatest roles we ever play are not on screen, but in the hearts of those we love. And that was Robert Redford's final gift to the world. A reminder that even legends carry fragile hearts. A reminder that the truest measure of a life is not in fame, not in fortune, but in the courage to admit what and who matters most when the curtain finally falls.